Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In this webinar, Julia Sadusky, licensed clinical psychologist, Catholic author, and speaker, will provide invaluable insights for youth workers, teachers, parents, and pastoral leaders on how to approach sensitive conversations about sexuality with compassion, authenticity, and fidelity to the Church's teachings. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the publicist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the questions box here on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email, and you are welcome to share this with colleagues, friends, family, etc. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Julia Sadusky is a licensed clinical psychologist and the owner of Lux Counseling and Consulting. She is the author of 2 books with Ave, Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex and Talking with Your Teens About Sex, and is a consultant, speaker, and adjunct professor. Sadusky has done extensive research in sexual development and specializes in trauma-informed care. She earned a bachelor's degree from Ave Maria University and a master's degree and doctorate in clinical psychology from Regent University. She is an affiliate member of the American Psychological Association, and her clinical practice is in Colorado. Julia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's so good to be here. I'm excited to share.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay. Wonderful.
Okay, you can take it from here.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody. It's so good to be with you all, and I'm excited to get to talk a little bit about accompaniment at the intersection of faith and same-sex sexuality. So we'll probably spend about the next 30 minutes just really diving into some key principles that I think are really helpful for youth workers, for parents, for people in ministry of all kinds, to really better accompany people in our communities who are navigating questions around sexual orientation and Catholic faith. And so the first thing I want to do is actually just lay a little bit of the kind of foundation through language. So it seems to me to be the case that language is really the door into conversations with youth around sexuality. And many of the adults that I speak with and meet with are pretty concerned about how to use language and even what different terminology means when talking with youth. And so there's generational gaps to consider there. There's even questions people might have about which language ought we use in these conversations. And so I think just identifying some terminology is a helpful place to start. So when we're thinking in terms of sexual attraction or romantic attraction, what are we talking about here? When somebody says I'm same-sex attracted or I'm opposite sex attracted, what does that mean? Well, sexual attraction is really the most descriptive way to talk about an experience of non-volitional romantic and sexual interest, which can be towards men, towards women, or both sexes. So at puberty, people find themselves with attractions, and the majority of the population experiences attraction pretty exclusively towards the opposite sex. And so sexual attraction, I'm attracted to this sex, is probably the most descriptive way to talk about that reality for people. So what is sexual orientation? So if attraction is kind of a descriptive way to talk about it, orientation is really when there's an enduring pattern and direction of a person's attraction. So think specifically when these attractions persist in strength over time. So a person might use different terms to talk about their orientation. So I'm primarily oriented in this or that direction. So a person might use terms like heterosexual, homosexual, same-sex attracted, straight, bisexual, gay, lesbian, to talk about the kind of persistent and enduring direction of their attraction over time. Now, some people may not use certain terms by virtue of feeling like maybe there's not this enduring pattern of attraction yet. So I see this sometimes with a 12-year-old where they say, you know, this is the word I use, but I don't really mean by that that's my orientation, because I've really only been attracted to people for 2 years. So I don't know what that means for me over time. But certainly increasingly we see young people adopting terminology that's tied to orientation earlier and earlier. So you will hear youth who say, you know, I'm gay or queer or same-sex attracted, even if they're kind of new to exploring identity in this way. So that brings us actually to this next piece, which is sexual identity. So this is the way in which a person might communicate attractions or orientation through identity language. So there's been a attunement to this, especially in recent years, where people are more often associating orientation with identity categories. So sometimes when people use identity language like I am blank, I am queer, they mean by that, this is really central to my sense of self or how I understand myself today. And then there's other people who might use identity language like I might use it as a psychologist, where I tell you I'm a psychologist, but that doesn't tell you what's maybe most central or most important to my identity, but it is an aspect of how I experience the world, how I think about things, how I interpret things. And so sexual identity labels can be used differently for different people, which can make it challenging in ministry to know what does a person mean when they use this or that term. Are they telling me this is their attraction? Are they telling me this is their primary orientation? Or are they telling me this is kind of a central aspect to identity? And then we have the term sexual minorities. And I think because in our communities, you know, people kind of fall all over the place as far as where they land with how they use language, whether they use different terms. And I think I always try to find what is language that can talk about the group of people we're going to talk about today in a way that's not demeaning and diminishing, but also doesn't prescribe a specific term as if there's only one way to talk about any of this in our circles. So sexual minorities is a kind of umbrella term that can be applied to a person who, by virtue of their pattern of sexual attraction, is in a numerical minority. So I mentioned earlier, the majority of people are attracted exclusively to the opposite sex. So sexual minorities is anybody for whom that attraction pattern is not exclusively to the opposite sex. So what this does is it keeps us from prescribing a certain term, like, you know, that loses some of the people in our communities who may identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or may not identify with those terms for a variety of reasons. So when a young person shares with you, I'm blank, I'm gay, I'm bisexual, I'm same-sex attracted, whatever terms they might use, it's actually more important to ask them a few questions than to try to focus maybe on the language itself. Like they may say I'm queer, and you could respond to that a lot of different ways, but a good question that I learned in ministry is saying to somebody, you know, tell me a little bit about what drew you to that term. So if they say I'm same-sex attracted or I'm gay, what drew you to that term is a good question to ask. And another good question to ask is, you know, people use that term differently. You know, some people use it to say this is kind of central to my identity. Some people use it to say this is my orientation. It's kind of been around for a while. And some people are simply saying, I had a crush on a peer who's of the same sex last week, and I want to tell my youth minister that. And this is the word that I've been told can express that to somebody. And so it's good to know, what does a person mean by using that term? Because a lot of times this is the first place where we speak past each other in ministry, where a youth may say, you know, I'm gay, and an adult may assume a lot from the use of that term. And so being able to ask what drew them to that term, number one, and number two, what do they mean when they use that term, is a good place to start. The next thing I want to talk about is that in youth ministry, certainly in our families, in our Catholic communities, there's different models for ways to engage with conversations around sexual orientation, about sexual attraction. And here I just map 3 dominant ways that I see us trying to minister in this space. And spoiler alert, I'm going to move us towards the third. I'm going to try to help us explore what it is to be a cultural ambassador and to help kind of raise young people, young Catholics especially, who are cultural ambassadors in the world. So to be in the world and not of the world, what does that look like for our youth? So there's other models, other ways to engage, and here's the 2 that I see happening the most in our circles and outside of them. We have cultural warriors, we have cultural capitulators, and I want to share with you a little bit about how I see that play out in youth ministry. So the cultural warrior, you know, it may be a passionate person in ministry who really wants to challenge maybe some of the theoretical assumptions in culture today about moral relativism or postmodern theory, or anything that really threatens or challenges a Catholic anthropology of the person. So sometimes in youth ministry, you know, in my work in youth ministry, I can relate to this as well, that we can spring into almost what I might call a lecture mode with our youth, where we're like, I need to tell you how it is. Welcome, I'm going to tell you how it is. And I think if we're honest, you know, when I go to a place where I'm just simply talking at a young person about sexual orientation, it's often rooted in a fear, because it feels like the Catholic faith is being threatened by some of the maybe movements in our culture. And so sometimes this warrior mentality and even the language that flows from that, us versus them, those people out there, can really come from this us them mentality. Like everybody out there is against the faith and everybody in here is aligned with the faith, and we're being attacked, and so we have to kind of fight back and we have to tell people how it really is. And what I see happening in youth ministry when this is the quality of interactions around sexual orientation is youth tend to come out of that environment feeling alienated and rejecting the faith as merely hateful. So the cultural warrior, the person who's lecturing a group of students, is not hateful, by the way. As I just mentioned, they're trying to protect something worth protecting, which is our faith. But oftentimes young people see that, and what they're thinking and experiencing is either, in my own story, I'm part of the group of people that we're talking about here, or I have friends, people in my life who may be drawn to queer theory or may be drawn to moral relativism. And so I don't want to have to hate them. And it can feel to a young person, maybe in part because of where they're at developmentally, that, you know, you're either for somebody or you're against them. And so the strategy of just kind of telling somebody, this is how it is, this is Human Anthropology 101, even when it's absolutely true, seems to be, if that's the only strategy, falling short in some ways and really effectively engaging youth. So the second model is cultural capitulator, and the strategy in this group is not so much lecture as it is silence and apathy. So this might be the youth leader who's riding in the car with a bunch of youth, taking them to a conference, and the youth are talking about ideas that would be, let's say, at odds with a Catholic vision of the person. And the youth leader, who may be afraid of coming across as a warrior or you know, being perceived as unkind, may stay silent, may not say anything to help thicken the plot or increase understanding in that space. And really, people coming from this frame, and when I've kind of been in the spot of capitulating and staying silent, is often rooted in a fear due to lack of formation. So some people in youth ministry may fear, like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't feel like I know enough about this. And this is why we're doing this webinar, is to try to help make information more accessible to you. But maybe it's also you didn't feel very well formed in church teaching about different things, and you have questions about it. And so it feels dishonest to come in and say, hey, here's the answer, when you're wrestling with that in your own journey. So there can be fear of saying the wrong thing, or fear of not knowing what to say or how to say it. So the outcome of this approach can often be a loss of a distinction between a kind of distinctively Christian witness and cultural narratives. This is where I see young people who say, yeah, my family's Catholic, but I feel like why would I go to youth group? It's kind of like my clubs at school. There's not anything I'm getting at youth group that's different from a club. We eat, we play games, and that's really that. I don't hear much about what makes Catholicism Catholicism. And so the capitulator can miss out on offering what are distinctively Catholic ways of understanding the person in a way that young people can really relate to, engage with, and wrestle with, frankly, over time. So cultural ambassadorship is really maybe a third way that takes kind of the best of what the warrior is trying to do, the best of what the capitulator is trying to do, and says, okay, what does it look like to be formed in cultural ambassadorship? So the ability to engage culture effectively, to critically evaluate theories and ideas, to respectfully challenge them at times, while also holding a high value of people. And where does that start, right? What's the strategy there? I think actually the strategy there is allowing myself to be formed and inviting others to be formed in virtue and Christ-likeness. And how do we do that as Catholics? Well, we invite youth into the sacramental life of the church, right? We ourselves partake in the sacramental life of the church. If I have a young person who shares with me that they're attracted to people of the same sex, I may take them to prayer and adoration and pray for God to send supports in their life who can accompany them, people of faith who can walk with them. I may pray for the grace to be one of those people. I may ask God for help with specific questions that come up in their journey. But the strategy here is actually starting with me being formed. It may be that, if you feel like you haven't gotten a ton of formation of why does the church say what it says about a sexual ethics? Well, maybe there's room to learn more, to read more, to study about some of these principles. And this seems to me to be rooted in courage, which will be required of us in this work, compassion, so the willingness to suffer with somebody, and conviction, having clarity about what I believe about the human person, what I believe about sexual ethics, and to hold that out with clarity, yes, and flexibility in my posture towards people, meaning that if I sit across from a young person who really, really disagrees with me and disagrees with what the church teaches, that young person is no longer a threat to me, that young person is not somebody I see as an enemy, but actually I see them as a child of God who's really reckoning with what God has to say, and that there's actually nowhere else I'd rather them be to do that than in a youth group setting or in my RCIA class and those kinds of things. And being a cultural ambassador also lets us critically engage with culture. So we don't just swallow whole what our culture offers about all kinds of things, but we're kind of engaging with it. And this can take place in terms of talking about media or different celebrities that young people are drawn to, and kind of taking the good. Here's what I appreciate about, Taylor Swift and what she's offering, and maybe here's some questions I have about this or that thing. Now, some listeners who are big fans of Taylor Swift are saying, hey, wait, don't talk about Taylor Swift negatively. And I think that gives us an example of how our youth feel when we engage conversations around sexuality, that we want to be able to engage culture, but not villainize culture, and also not swallow it completely whole. So a really fascinating stat that kind of brings us to our next point in this conversation is a recent Gallup poll, the latest being in 2022, that found that about 20% of Gen Z adults today are identifying as LGBT. that is a remarkably high number compared to what we've seen historically in prevalence estimates. And we don't have time to go into all the whys of why that might be. We may get a question of that in the Q&A, but either way, what I often remind us in ministry and parenting is that we could spend time and energy, and I think there's value in this, spending time and energy looking and wondering, how did we get to where we are? And certainly in psychology, we do that. In the social sciences, we reflect on that. At the same time, if all we do is look back and try to map how we got to where we are, that doesn't always translate into being effective where we are. And so certainly the number of young people coming into our youth environments, into Catholic schools, are increasingly going to be sharing more often than before about experiences of same-sex sexuality. And the question becomes, how do we be equipped to enter into that where we are? And while there is value in looking back, if all we're doing in ministry is trying to piece together how we got here, we miss out on an opportunity to know what to do now that we're here. And God's not surprised by where we are. God's not scandalized, kind of scrambling for a plan B, but he is ready to equip us here, where increasingly young people are sharing about their experiences in our communities. And I would actually offer that that's a good thing, that's actually a compliment when we're brought into these experiences with somebody. They're saying, I trust you enough to invite you into this area of my experience. And so versus in the secular culture, where sometimes conversations about sexuality can be a bit profane, or there's not an honoring of the sacredness of those spaces, I think in our communities we can really appreciate the gravity and the sacredness of receiving somebody's experience in this way. So I want to kind of bring that into conversations with our youth as well. So the next thing I want to talk for a minute about is attractions. That in adolescence, attractions are part and parcel of navigating the world as a developing young person. And so the average onset of attraction for young people is about age 10. That varies person to person, but right around age 10, you've probably had your first crush. And it is of value to acknowledge that. I think sometimes we jump in youth contexts and parenting right to dating. And what we're finding from the research today is that young people are actually dating exclusively less and less in adolescence. And so I think we're missing out sometimes in our ministry and formation to remember that actually where young people are living in adolescence is navigating attraction more often than they're even dating at this point. So what do attractions bring? Well, sometimes they can bring confusion for people. What does it mean that I experience this attraction? Sometimes crushes can be painful for people, like I'm attracted to this person and they're not attracted to me, and what does that mean about my sense of self? What does that mean about my value? And so these are the things that we can certainly be talking about with all of our youth. Crushes are something that teens do well to talk about with other people, to what they trust, not just telling everybody this is who I have a crush on, but in pockets of safety, being able to share, hey, I have a crush on this person, and maybe I don't know what to do with it. That's really relevant to this age range, and certainly relevant to youth experiencing same-sex sexuality. Because for some of these youth, and often for many of them, these crushes can be hard to navigate. Maybe for our youth group, we're going to an overnight trip, and there's somebody I'm attracted to, and we're going to be kind of sharing a kind of lodge area together, and how do I navigate that? I'm going to be distracted. I'm going to have a hard time sleeping, and being able to have a trusted adult that they can talk about that with is helpful. Encouraging and cultivating healthy friendships is really key. And discussing how a draw to a person can teach us things about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how it also can be distracting at times. I think sometimes with youth experiencing same-sex attraction, they're kind of eager to look at what does the church have to say, and read in the catechism some of the language of, disordered sexual desire. And it can be very confusing to them when they find themselves with attraction where they say, I'm drawn to this person's smile, or I'm drawn to their sense of humor. And it feels to them like, how can that be both bad and good at the same time? Like, what's bad about being drawn to their smile? But maybe there is something immoral about, same-sex sexual behavior, but how does that all fit? And so helping acknowledge the fact that our attractions, when we're drawn to somebody, even just drawn to them as a person, that can teach us about the true, the good, and the beautiful, that God created that person. And being drawn to people can also be a source of distraction, a source of lust. I remember when I was studying at Ave Maria in undergrad that I studied under a professor who helped us understand a bit more about theology of the body. And he shared something I'll never forget. His name's Mikhail Waldstein. And what he said was this. He said, lust is actually not seeing too much, it's seeing too little. And so the idea is that our attractions have the capacity to help us appreciate the good in a person, but they also do have the capacity to kind of narrow our understanding when lust is in the picture. And so again, just kind of inviting a holistic understanding of attraction being a part of the experience of youth and helping them figure out how to navigate what can be muddy waters of attraction at times. The next thing I want to do is just really map for us what youth are navigating when they're navigating same-sex sexuality. Maybe for some people listening, this is a part of your own story, and so this will feel like familiar territory to you. And maybe for others listening, this is not part of your story, and you may be wondering, what is it like for youth who are navigating same-sex sexuality? So I want to offer just a little bit of research and try to make it not so dense, but research that's drawn from a line of research understanding the experience of Christian sexual minorities in Christian colleges. And this comes out of work by Mark Yarhouse. And when we look at the sexual orientation development of young people navigating same-sex sexuality, here's what we find. That in Christian young people, the average age of an initial awareness of same-sex attraction is usually about 12.9. So that can be younger for some, older for others, but usually by that age, young people are becoming really aware of same-sex attraction that they're experiencing. Maybe they've had a couple of crushes, and so it feels like maybe this isn't a phase, and they start to wonder about that. Right around the same age is when young people start to make initial attributions about their attractions. And what I mean by that is attributions like, what does this mean about me? So does this mean I'm gay? Does this mean I'm going to be attracted to the same sex my whole life? Does this mean, I can't get married to somebody of the opposite sex? Could I be a priest? This is where you start to hear these questions in young people. Interestingly, right around that time is when some young people report confusion. So what does this mean? And a lot of confusion and distress about this experience of attraction. I want you to pay attention to that next milestone, disclosure, and notice the average age of that. Whereas about 13 is where that confusion is being reported and attributions are being made. It's not until 17, on average, that young people in Christian communities are opening up about their experience of same-sex attraction. That ought to really get your attention. That means that for 4 years, on average, and I've heard way more than 4 and certainly less than 4 as well, where people are waiting to tell anybody about their experience. And then I think in our Catholic circles, sometimes by the time they tell us, it feels like we're kind of coming at the back end of their journey because they've been navigating this without us for a long time. And they've been probably getting guidance from peers and from social media and from a lot of other things other than our communities. And so I think just recognizing that, and I find myself wondering in ministry, what are the things we can be doing to help close that gap? To make it more likely that young people are going to invite us into these experiences at a younger age so that they can walk this out in community of Catholics who can help guide them and walk with them, more importantly here. And so I think being able to target that will be what we'll spend the rest of our time together doing is what are the things that help increase the likelihood that young people are going to be bringing this type of exploration into our communities earlier. By around the same time as disclosure happens, people are making attributions about different labels. People may privately identify with certain words. So private identity is really how a person labels themselves when they look in the mirror. Public identity being more of how I talk about myself with other people. So a youth in a youth group may very often be thought of as attracted to the opposite sex, when really they privately may identify as gay or as same-sex attracted. And right, or as they get a little older, they start to tell people, right, about these experiences and label publicly in some cases as well. Now, you also see here this question about same-sex relationships, and it's right around, between 17 and 19 that we, on average, see Christian young people asking the question about same-sex relationships. Is that morally permissible? What would that look like? Do I explore that? Or maybe they already have explored that, and they're wondering about that. So I put that here just to show that young people are going to be asking questions about relationships in our communities. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So when it comes to ministry and raising youth and all of those pieces, I think it's helpful not just to know the milestones that many young people are navigating and wondering about, and needing help, by the way, within, but also what questions are a young person asking when they first become aware of their attractions, versus what questions might they be asking later on as time goes on. And you can see that these questions evolve. Initially, it's what am I experiencing? And so you may be on the receiving end of that type of question. And the question, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of my same-sex sexuality in light of my faith? Maybe in my peer group at school, I'm told that, I have to leave behind my Christian faith, that you can't experience these things and be a Christian. And maybe in my faith community, I feel like I have to kind of get rid of these attractions, or I have to ignore them, and that's, if I kind of want to be a part of this community, I can't talk about that here. And so they're trying to make sense of their experience. Disclosure, the question becomes, who can I trust with this part of my life? Attributions around terminology, how do I think of myself? And the question of relationships, opposite sex relationships, same-sex relationships, the morality of those start to come in, because a person's often wondering, how are my needs for intimacy going to be met? Many of the teens that I meet with share with me that they know that they could live without sex, but they can't live without intimacy. And so the question becomes at 15, 16, 17, more about these kind of long-term questions, like if I live according to church teaching, am I destined to a life of loneliness? Like, who will I get to go on family vacation with if I don't marry heterosexually? Who will be there if my fridge breaks and I need a new fridge? Who will be there on my deathbed? These are the questions that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds are wrestling with when they're raised in the church and really trying to ask questions about relationships. And I think sometimes in our communities, we can too often be really scandalized almost by the questions young people are asking, like that young person, I can't believe they're wondering about a same-sex partnership. Don't they know? And we might go into lecture mode about, here's what the church teaches about that, which very well is true, but doesn't get at the deeper question that youth is having, which is, how will my needs for intimacy, to be known, to be loved, be met long-term? And I think being able to reflect those questions back to youth, instead of going and springing immediately into a lecture or staying silent, is really important. And then the question of public labeling, how do I want to be known by others? Again, reminding us that for many people, they may use labels as kind of short form to say, this is a part of my experience. But it's not always the case that these labels are used to say, this is the most central or most important part of my identity. And then I just recognize here in this next slide that parents are base camp. So I live in Colorado and I love to hike. And if you know anything about hiking, you know that there's a base camp where you go to get supplies. And you need that base camp to be solid, to have everything you need in order to really do well when you're hiking in the wilderness. And I think sexual orientation development can feel like the wilderness for a lot of young people in the church. It can be pretty scary, it can be pretty daunting, and we want to always in youth ministry be finding ways to build up base camp, build up relationships with parents, help improve communication between youth and their families, and increase access points to those resources over time. So for any of us who have been in a role of mentoring young people, we know that sometimes that can be difficult to do. A young person may trust you by virtue of you not being their parent. And we don't want to silo a young person from their parent, especially for youth who experience same-sex sexuality. When we look at all the research base that we have in psychology around the predictors of their well-being over time and the quality of their well-being, here's what we find. That the quality of a young person's well-being, the number one predictor of the quality of their well-being is the quality of their relationship with their parents. So what does that mean? That means for a same-sex attracted or a gay teen who's in your youth group, helping them improve the quality of communication and closeness with their parents is actually going to be the best predictor of their well-being long-term, even more than other trusted mentors and supports. So any way we can really help bolster those relationships is going to be really key here. Another thing that often comes up in our communities is how do we make a kind of secure base for all of our youth when some of our youth are going to be navigating same-sex sexuality and some of our youth are not. I think the way we do this, and it won't surprise us maybe in light of what we've already been talking about, is we do want to hold out our sexual ethics with humility and an open hand, meaning we're inviting youth into a place to wrestle with our faith in all the ways, right? We hold out the reality of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. We hold out the reality of, all the teachings we have and dogmas around the Blessed Mother and the value of the Rosary for prayer and adoration in these pieces. And we're maybe at our best expecting youth today to really wrestle with these pieces. I think if any of us are honest, when we were 14, we probably weren't convicted and convinced by every aspect of what our faith has to offer us. And so expecting that from youth and offering them the teachings of the church with an open hand, inviting them into it to wrestle with it in our communities. I think too often, and maybe if you went to Catholic school, you can relate to this in our Catholic formation, it can be the case that we kind of want young people to just tell us the right answer. And it's harder when they wrestle. And so I think inviting and expecting that is really important. The next thing I want to recommend is really reducing shame around experiences of same-sex attraction by a simple language tweak. So I mentioned earlier us versus them, that a lot of times in our circles we can talk about them out there, the LGBT people out there, or the same-sex attracted people who have left the faith, or whatever it might be. And sometimes in our Catholic communities, not always, the language we use signals that we don't think there's any people with this experience in our communities. So a simple language tweak is this: when you're talking about same-sex sexuality in your settings, in your family, in your church, maybe try saying those among us who experience same-sex attraction, or those among us who identify as LGBT, those among us who are exploring sexual orientation questions, to signal we know that you're here. And what I want youth to know is there's nowhere else we'd rather them be than in our communities as they navigate questions around sexual orientation. Another really important piece is when you hear comments in maybe a youth group setting or in your home that are diminishing of the dignity and value of people with this experience, that you would say out loud, we don't talk about people that way here. So often, we in our communities are really good at reminding people that we believe that people are made in the image and likeness of the invisible God. What we often struggle with, I think, is then when somebody shares something that is demeaning of the dignity of a person, how do we respond as Catholics to one another in our communities when these comments are being made? And I think so much of our credibility as Catholic witnesses rises and falls in how we kind of admonish one another when we talk in a demeaning way about people who experience same-sex sexuality, even people we disagree with, right? We want our youth to know that the person I disagree with most doesn't give me just a right to demean their dignity and talk poorly about them. I can disagree with them, and I can do that with respect. Now, also what can happen in our youth groups is there can be youth who are wrestling with different aspects of this. Maybe a youth who doesn't have the experience of same-sex attraction, but is really concerned about some of the cultural narratives that have shifted around same-sex sexuality that are tied more to queer theory or gender theory. And so you may have one youth who is saying, I'm really concerned about that. I'm really concerned about relativism and postmodern theory and how that trickles down in people's understanding of identity. And then right next to them, you may have another youth who feels really protective of marginalized groups and wants to talk about that in youth group. And there can be tension there. And so as a youth leader or as a parent in a family, when this comes up, being able to honor the valid concerns, by the way, the kind of fundamental concerns that each group has, and try to find the place of unity. So the one young person who maybe is really concerned about narratives that challenge the dignity of the human person and a Catholic anthropology. And then on the other hand, a person who's trying to attend to the one and the marginalized and say, gosh, wouldn't you know that God actually cares about both of those things? And so for both of you, even though your maybe lens or initial perspective is focusing on a different aspect, these are both really important concerns that Catholics ought to care about. Another piece to consider is identifying superordinate goals with the broader culture. So being able to really say, what are the things that we can agree with in the secular culture around LGBT experiences? Things like we don't want youth with this experience to experience homelessness. We want youth navigating same-sex sexuality to not be bullied in school. And ask the question, what are we doing in our faith communities to ensure that we are combating unjust discrimination, like the Catechism calls us to? Being able to show youth that we care about that in varied ways is really key. And always pointing young people back to Christ. You know, I'm reminded of a talk I was giving to a youth group in the last year, and there was a young person who was really wrestling with a Catholic sexual ethic and was kind of going back and forth, as you would want him to in that setting. And you know, I reflected to him as our time came to an end that I just really admired the fact that he was wrestling with God. And I said, I hope you stay in the Catholic Church, and I hope you keep doing that. In fact, even if you resolve this and you really feel like you come to terms with Catholic teaching on X, Y, or Z, there will be other things in your life that you wrestle with in your faith. And I hope you know that there's always a place for you in the church to bring that to Christ. And it's a compliment, actually, to God and to his church that you stay and wrestle in community. And then finally, what I want to offer to you is that, you know, a lot of times the young people I meet with same-sex sexuality really believe that by virtue of same-sex attraction, they're going to be a less than Catholic. It's as if the only way to be a fully alive Catholic is to no longer experience same-sex attraction for some of the people I meet with. And so what I want to offer is that in the Catechism, there's this really beautiful line where it says that young people or people with same-sex attraction, you know, can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection, which implies that young people are capable of that, navigating this space. I mean, certainly all of us are invited by Christ to live a virtuous life. And I think sometimes we expect so little of our youth that we kind of either see them as a kind of a problem to be solved, or a person who will be able to be Christ-like one day, but isn't quite there. And maybe that comes from how we view ourselves as well, but really encouraging our young people to remember that they can and they will, with God's grace, resolutely approach Christian perfection in their experiences and not in spite of them. So I want to stop there, and I think we're going to move to a time of Q&A.
Yes. Thank you so much, Julia. I'll give you a chance to take a breath here, and I invite all of our attendees to submit questions. And just so you know that the questions are asked anonymously, other people on the webinar today will not see those questions. I just wanted to put that out there for you. Julie, you have such a way of helping us, work through this and showing us really the nuances of those people that we will interact with in our lives, who really need our love and our compassion and the truth. And so we thank you so much for the time that you have spent with us today. One question someone has asked is regarding the executive order that Trump signed yesterday, stating that only the male and female sexes will be recognized. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I did see that come through, and I'm sure, like a lot of people, I'm going to be processing that in my own way personally. Yeah. There's all kinds of ways that impacts people, as far as I think what I'm hearing in my clinical practice is there's people who feel relieved at that, like, wow, that feels like a reflection of something true. And then there's people who feel kind of erased in that. So people who are navigating questions around gender, for instance, who might say, gosh, that feels maybe like an attack. And so I certainly see that in Catholic people, right? Really impacting them differently. And so as a person of faith, I would say that for me, I don't feel entirely called into the political domain very much. And so, yeah, I God bless the people who do, but that's really not where I live. And I care about, our country and care about the direction it's going as a Catholic. And yet I think where I live is more in the kind of personal walking with people than in some of those political domains, although they certainly trickle down.
Absolutely. Let's see, we've got questions coming here. This was excellent. Part of maturing is dating, learning to navigate relationships. How do we encourage youth with same-sex attraction to navigate this?
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective. I think, it is interesting to see the data today that young people are dating less and less. I had a teen this week tell me, I don't know if you know this is how she said it, but we don't date, we talk. So that was funny, but there's a lot of that happening. And so what I would say is I do think insofar as dating is a relationship, it is a really important part of maturation. But truth be told, the thing about dating that makes it helpful is the cultivation of skills for relationships long term. Like that can happen in friendship, and it happens in some nuanced ways in dating as well. So when a young person is dating, I think what I want to offer people in ministry and parents is you want to know who they're dating. You want to know who that person is. You want to be able to be a sounding board for those experiences, because young people need support in navigating safety, health, boundaries in human relationships, and dating is no exception. And with youth, when they are dating, it can become very siloing. So it can actually be stunting of maturation in some cases, where they become so kind of focused on the dating relationship that they're missing out on friendship. That would be a common dynamic. And so being able to hold out, yes, dating is a part of this picture. Dating is not the only way to build maturation, certainly at that age. But we don't want to take the posture that dating is all bad in our communities and say, oh, you're too immature to date. Well, they will date, they just won't tell you about it. Or conversely, pushing them that they have to be dating when so many of them won't. And for many youth, not dating brings up a lot of insecurities. And so I actually think youth contexts are better when we're talking with youth about the fact that when they're not dating, how do they make sense of that in a way that's not demeaning of their value?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Thank you, Julia. Very well presented. I have read your books on gender and have found them so helpful. Do you have any suggestions on how to get our pastor and youth ministry leaders to be open to be more pastoral to our youth, even when I can't even get them? Let's see. We'll just end it right there. So more pastoral to our youth, open and more pastoral.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, this is true outside of our communities, but in them as well, that it can feel difficult to prioritize, I think, minority experiences in kind of programming, that there can be pastors sometimes feeling like this opens up kind of variables that we haven't thought of, and kind of dynamics that maybe we're not aware of. And I think gently, as Catholic to a Catholic, you can navigate that differently and come in and kind of say, what's wrong with you? You're terrible. How dare you not care about these young people? I like more of the approach of just real gently reminding somebody that, right, Christ did come for the one, and he was definitely willing to go out from the 99 and bring the one. And so really connecting what we're being called to do in the current culture to what Christ is asking us to do. And then extending that even more to say, it is complicated. And Father, what can I do to help make it less complicated for you? To make kind of, I want to help make this possible, recognizing too that the territory we're in evangelization is not just the one, it's also the 99 watching how we treat the one. And I wish it didn't take that, to be honest. I wish Christ would help us more proactively to feel a heart for people navigating questions around gender in our communities. But I think sometimes it does take being a bit of a squeaky wheel to say, people are here, people are needing the love of Christ, and how are we offering spaces and places where people can occupy in our communities? And we haven't done a good job of that, if we're honest. And I think Pope Francis has been willing to acknowledge that, and it serves us to acknowledge that, because it shows a lot of humility when we can do that.
Most definitely. Another question: do you have recommendations for how to accompany young people who are Catholic and choose to be in a same-sex relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it seems from the recent data that we've been following, Gallup polls and that kind of thing, about perspectives on same-sex marriage, that, many Catholics, not just Catholic people attracted to the same sex, but Catholics attracted to the opposite sex, are not compelled by church teaching on sexual ethics. I mean, that's true in contraception and masturbation and a lot of other areas. And so our ministry terrain does and will involve walking with people who are not living according to church teaching in that area. I like to point out that that's already true with every one of us. Actually, every one of us doesn't perfectly live according to church teaching in our life. So it's maybe helpful to ask ourselves, what do I do with everybody I'm in contact with who is not living perfectly God's call for our lives? And there's nuances to that, but I think too often in our communities, this group of people has kind of been elevated as a particularly kind of wayward group. And actually, as a person of faith who lives in the world where most people are heterosexual, heterosexuality is not the gauge of holiness. That there's plenty of sin in our communities all over the board. And so remembering that, and then what I hear from people who are in same-sex relationships is that it's hard in Catholic circles for them to not be treated almost as invisible. Like, I can't talk to you because if I talk to you or if I ask about the person you're dating, I'm somehow condoning this. And again, I would offer that if somebody's in a same-sex relationship, that means that person is a part of their life. And wouldn't it be good as a Catholic to know and care about the people in that person's life? And so that's one thing, is not acting as if somebody's invisible, but remembering that we can treat people with the respect and dignity that they are due, and that that's an act of justice actually when we do that. I think sometimes another piece of this is just really being able to be honest and feel like you've been able to be honest at some point about kind of where you land with your understanding of sexuality. I think sometimes, though, as Catholics, we can feel like we need to set a timer where it's not been, more than 2 months since the last time I let somebody know, and so I have to tell them again. And so I would not recommend feeling the pressure to have to repeatedly tell somebody where you fall, and especially when you're walking with somebody who also is Catholic, remembering they have a conscience, they have been given the graces of baptism, and if they're not living in accordance with church teaching on sexual ethics, it's probably not because nobody's told them what that is. And so with humility, being able to hold out that is demanding of me, and I am being called by Christ apparently to walk with a person who's where this person is, and how do I be a witness to Christ, but also point them to a relationship with him. I think we forget that for any one of us, when we are compelled to follow Jesus in a deeper way, in whatever way that looks in our lives, it's because we know him and trust him and are getting to know him more in community. And so being able to cultivate a person's personal relationship with Jesus is going to go a lot farther than just kind of giving them answers that we've been given about different pieces of this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What do you do for or with a person who has decided they are just always going to be at odds with the church because they are only attracted to the same sex? A friend questions if she can receive the Eucharist, as she feels same-sex relationships are valid and acceptable, and hopes for one in her future. While she is fully committed to her faith in Christ, she feels she cannot be committed to the church, or that the church does not want her. I don't know what to tell her other than I am her friend regardless and am praying for her.
That's such a beautiful question. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, sometimes in our circles, what we do is we kind of pretend that it's different than it is. Maybe a good example of this is like a Protestant loved one comes to mass for a wedding, and maybe for some of us, we don't want to say, hey, actually, by virtue of not being in full communion, do your hands for a blessing or not go up for communion, and that can be really hard, right? But if you were to just say, oh yeah, go for it, and then somebody else sees it and they react really strongly and shame that person and are really unkind to them, are you really helping them by pretending like, yeah, everything's cool, come on in, receive communion in any Catholic church as a Protestant or whatever it might be? It's not a perfect parallel, but I find in these conversations, some of us are wanting our faith communities to be a little bit different than they are in a variety of ways, including saying things like, oh, we want you here, you're welcome, the church is ready to receive you in X, Y, or Z ways. And that's not always the case. And so being actually validating and honest about, yeah, there are differences here, and there are ways in which there's a felt division there that the person's hitting on, and being compassionate for that distance, wishing for that to be different, and trying to find ways for a person to participate in the life of the church if they want to. I have a friend who has really been captivated by the Catholic faith and has her own journey around some of these pieces, and has really fallen in love with adoration, and that has been such an access point to her, and a place of certainly suffering in feeling maybe like, will that full communion be possible for me in these ways? But I think that's the heart that I'm seeing in Pope Francis is how do we open the doors wide to people, and bring in these access points for grace where possible, while recognizing there are limitations to that and being clear about that, and instead of acting as if those aren't there. That can really be confusing and hurtful for people when they bump up against those limits at some point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This has been, again, so helpful. I have another question somebody asked. How could they book an appointment with you?
Yeah, so the best way is to go on my website, which is just my first and last name.com, and there's a contact form there that goes to my office manager.
Okay, wonderful. And I'll try to include that in the follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, for all of your thoughtful questions, and for spending this time with us on, a topic that's tough to talk about, but also super valuable, as we know that young people are so important in our lives and in our church. So, Julia, thank you for, again, spending time with us, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. Um, I should not forget to mention the two books that you have written with Ave. And these certainly would be helpful for the attendees online to be able to, you give a lot of the language that I think we struggle with, kind of like scenarios. If somebody has this, what could you say in response? Which are super helpful. Do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I would just say that, I'm hearing from a lot of people that, that blue book is for parents and trusted adults of kids 0 to 9. The second book, the orange one, is for parents and trusted adults of people 10 to 18. And with the teen book, I'm hearing from adults who didn't get the sex education they needed, that they're liking reading it just for themselves. It's kind of people getting formation in ways maybe they didn't learn. And so kind of single, married people alike are really enjoying that one, just to learn more about the things we didn't get maybe in our own formation.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much. If you order at Ave Maria Press, you can use code webinar 0121 for today's date and get a 10% off. These books, of course, are available on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold also. So I invite you to join us next week. We're going to do a little retreat with the Psalms, with Shannon Wimp-Schmidt, and really kind of immerse ourselves in the wisdom and comfort of the Psalms. So we hope that you can join us for that. And with that, I'd say thank you so much again, Julia. Everybody have a great week. Hopefully you're staying warm out there. And thanks for supporting our webinar series. Bye-bye. Take care.